This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear the interview with Peter Schiff of Euro-Pacific Capital, who's considering a run for Senate. Remember to go to our homepage at www.kingworldnews.com for more interviews, where this week we have Bob Prechter from Elliott Wave International, as well as Jeff Burns, CEO of Pan American Silver. Joining us now is Peter Schiff, president of Euro-Pacific Capital. Last time you were interviewed here on King World News, you made the following statement, quote, "We are going down a slippery slope, and every time we do one thing, we create a bigger problem. So the government usurps more and more power to try and solve it. And so if you just connect the dots, we're going to get exchange controls. We're going to have black markets. We're going to have price controls. We're going to have shortages. All sorts of bad things are going to happen because of one mistake after another that I see happening right now, because nobody is standing up and saying this is wrong. It's like the government is trying to put out a fire with gasoline, so the fire just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and instead of questioning what they are doing, they just reach for more gasoline," end quote. I want to talk to you about your potential run for Congress now, because you have talked about this country's problems, and you said in that last interview, nobody's standing up and saying this is wrong. My question for you is, what compelled you to consider running? Because something compelled you to take this step. What was it that pushed you over the edge, Peter?
Well, just watching, what they're doing. Watching what Congress is doing, one mistake after another, understanding how serious these problems are and what's going to happen to this country if we don't put a stop to what they're doing.
From the Hartford Courant yesterday, it's twilight in Peter Schiff's America, and if painful and drastic changes aren't made soon, he foresees an economic depression lasting at least a decade. The future as envisioned by Schiff will be marked by rampant inflation. A gallon of gas could cost $10, food shortages and rolling blackouts unless government sharply shrinks and the free market is allowed to flourish, end quote. What do we need to do here, Peter, in order to avoid that bleak future?
Well, we've got to stop what we're doing right now. We've got to let the markets function. We've got to understand, though, that the recession is actually a necessary cleansing process, that the mistakes were built up over the years, and it's during the recession that we finally deal with those mistakes. And we have to rebuild a viable economy again. We can't just keep spending borrowed money and growing government. We have to save our money. We have to produce again. We have to make capital investments, and we have to shrink government. But weaning us from the bubble economy to a legitimate economy, there's going to be some short-term transitional pain. But if we simply try to avoid the pain, we're going to be in agony.
You stated recently, or it was in another article, the current crisis is payback for a decade of reckless monetary policy. Schiff says the recession is not the problem. The recession is the cure. It's not fun, just like heroin withdrawal is not fun, but it's necessary. Why is the government continually standing in the way of us cleansing the system, Peter?
Because they don't want to admit that there's a problem. And we have a problem because of their monetary policy and their fiscal policy. And they want to tell us that everything is great. They want us to believe that it's just a function of getting more credit flowing, that getting consumers back into the shopping centers and in the auto showroom, if they can just get enough spending that we can get the economy back. But that's not the way it works. The more we spend, the bigger the hole we're going to dig for ourselves. That's what they don't want to acknowledge, that simply borrowing money to buy stuff and pretending the economy is growing, that was the myth. Ignoring all the debt and just assuming that, because the GDP is going up, that everything is okay, that's the problem. They don't want to acknowledge that we've been living in this phony economy because it's their policies that have created it.
What about the Fed, Peter, and their policy? How much of our problems today lay at the feet of the Federal Reserve?
Oh, a large portion of our problems can be directly attributed to Federal Reserve policy. If it wasn't for the Federal Reserve, interest rates wouldn't be so low. If interest rates weren't this low, we wouldn't have this ridiculous phony economy because people couldn't so easily borrow money. There'd be a higher cost there. We couldn't have had all this speculation. And, of course, if we had a legitimate Federal Reserve that refused to monetize government debt, we couldn't have these terrific budget deficits. Congress would be forced to act responsibly because the Federal Reserve wouldn't be there to bail them out.
From a recent article in the Digital Journal, Schiff, like Mark Faber, could see the U.S. with Zimbabwe-style inflation, where the Zimbabweans bring barrels of money to pay for a loaf of bread, end quote. I interviewed Dr. Mark Faber this week and asked him to comment on hyperinflation in Weimar Germany. Because, Peter, the backbone of a country, as you said, are those who work and save to help cultivate a healthy capitalist system, right? And they're wiped out in a hyperinflation. And many of those people in Germany fled the country or committed suicide because of their financial ruin. And then, of course, we had the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany. If we continue continue down this path of hyperinflation, which you're telling us we're on, how bad will things become for citizens of this country? What will life be like in hyperinflation?
Well, hyperinflation is about the worst possible environment, worse than just a depression. During the Great Depression, for a lot of people, it wasn't that bad. If you still had a job, you didn't lose your money in the stock market, if you had your money in the bank, prices went down. Consumer goods became less expensive. Asset prices fell for you. It was okay. And as long as you had a job or you had your savings, your money went further. But in hyperinflation, people with cash get wiped out. People who avoided speculating, people who didn't get suckered in, they get wiped out. The elderly living on fixed incomes, the fixed incomes are wiped out. People's savings, their wages are destroyed. So even if you have a job, it's going to be difficult to buy food. It's going to be difficult to buy energy because it's going to be so expensive. So it's worse. And that's the scenario that we're going for. Because all the actions that the government is pursuing to try to fight off the recession, that is what's sowing the seeds for the inflationary depression or hyperinflation if they don't ultimately do the right thing, which is one of the reasons why I want to try to get into the Senate so that we can do the right thing sooner rather than later, because the longer we wait, the more painful it's going to be to do it. And, of course, the more painful it is to do the right thing, the less likely it is that we do the right thing, which means the higher and higher is the probability that we do get the worst-case scenario, we do get the hyperinflation, and that's going to be a complete unmitigated disaster.
Some of their arguments are basically, or you hear people say, Peter, we really can't in reality service or pay back this debt that we built up as a nation. And so the argument is that we need to inflate. And I have an issue with that, and I know you do as well. But you talk about Greenspan or Bernanke. And my question for you is this: how bad is what this man is doing to our country? Because you really, when you debauch a currency, Peter, you go right after the moral fabric and compass of a nation, do you not?
Yeah, exactly. And, if you make the logical conclusion that we can't repay our debt, which is obvious, we've simply borrowed so much money that it's beyond the capability to actually pay it back, that you're going to say, well, let's just try to inflate it away. I would rather acknowledge that we can't pay it and restructure it rather than create inflation. Because when you restructure the debt, you ask the people who loaned us the money to take a hit. Because, after all, they were the ones foolish enough to buy all the bonds. So we make our foreign creditors, we make the Japanese or the Chinese or the rest of the world or anybody who owns U.S. government bonds, we make them settle for 50 cents on the dollar, 25 cents on the dollar. We restructure. But if we decide to wipe them out by printing money, we wipe out everybody. We wipe out people that never loaned the U.S. government money. We destroy our economy. We destroy the value of our savings. We destroy the value of our insurance policies. I mean, it's utter financial ruin. I mean, maybe it makes the politicians feel better because they can pretend they're not defaulting. But that is exactly what they're doing. So let's be honest about the way we restructure or default on our debt. Instead of doing it through inflation, which will create even more damage, let's just do it like an honorable person. Admit we can't pay and restructure, and then hopefully our creditors will say, you know what, we're not going to lend you any more money, which is exactly what we need. We need our creditors to stop lending, because we're taking the money and making the problems worse. The money that we're borrowing is going to grow government. And the bigger our government gets, the less productive our economy becomes.
I agree with you on that, Peter. So let me ask you this then. When do you think inflation will start to intensify and really accelerate, if you had to put a timetable on it?
Look, I think inflation is already here. We're already printing all the money. The question is, when will the effects of inflation, rising prices, be felt more pronouncedly? And I think it's already there. I mean, if you think about, we're in the biggest recession since the Great Depression, yet consumer prices are not plunging. I just got my health insurance renewal for my company. My health insurance premium is up 18% since last year. I mean, 18% in the biggest recession since the Depression, yet my health insurance costs go up 18%. Food is going up. Oil is getting more expensive. Prices are starting to rise, despite the fact that the economy is contracting. I mean, that is very, very problematic. We need lower prices to help get us out of this mess. But I think at some point in the next several years, you're going to start to see prices really spiraling out of control. And by then, when people start to talk about that and react to it, it'll be too late. And, of course, the CPI is not going to capture all of the inflation or all of the price increases, because it's deliberately designed to minimize price increases the way they run it through the CPI. So Americans will feel the inflation at the supermarket or at the gas station or, wherever they happen to buy things. They'll feel it in their pocketbooks far sooner than the government reflects it in its statistics.
You bring up an interesting point there. And I guess I talked to Dr. Mark Faber about this also, not this last interview, but the one before. And my question for you is this, Peter, because you brought up the fact that we're in this weak economic environment, the worst since World War II or post-World War II, and yet we're having inflation. So then, and I go back to France when they had the assignat and they would just print money and do this stimulus, right? The same thing we're doing today. And the economy would roll over and the government would meet and they would agree, well, let's just print more money. And there would be stages of inflation in France that they would go through as they would have recovery from each printing. Are we going to see in the United States then, as we have stimulus package after stimulus package, just a variety of stages of inflation that we'll go through as we see recoveries, happen, even though they may roll over?
Well, we're not going to get any recoveries. I mean, we might get something that the government claims is a recovery. We might get some kind of bounce in GDP, but it's simply going to be a function of spending more borrowed money. And so if the government says, hey, we got the GDP to go up, by 1 percentage point, but we increased the debt by $2 trillion or $3 trillion to produce that little bit of GDP growth, we're worse off. We're not better off, but they never look at the debt. They just see, well, can we get some spending? Can we get Americans to buy more stuff? And if we succeed, that means our economy is expanding. The more the government succeeds in getting us to spend more money by going into debt, the worse they make the problem. And so we get a little bit of a bounce, and then we're back in recession, and things are collapsing again. And now we've got a bigger problem to deal with because we've taken on even more debt to buy us a little bit of time.
In the interview with Dr. Mark Faber last week, he said that he expected the U.S. to do more stimulus packages, Peter, rather than let the stock market go to new lows. And last time you commented in the last interview that we have already overdosed on stimulus packages. And I believe Mark's right. I believe the government will continue to have stimulus package after stimulus package. Is that the road to hyperinflation that we're watching this real time?
Exactly. Well, that's ultimately the complete overdose on stimulus is hyperinflation. That's the analogy would be, a heroin addict finally dying of an overdose because he takes so much heroin. A monetary overdose is hyperinflation. And, the stimulus started a long time ago. Well, first of all, remember Bush's stimulus. They sent out those $200 or $300 stimulus checks. It didn't work. The economy went into recession despite the stimulus. And at the time he did that, not only was I against the stimulus, but I said, look, they're just going to do a bigger stimulus because they're going to say the reason it didn't work is because the stimulus wasn't big enough. And that's always going to be the reason. More stimulus, more stimulus, more stimulus. And the more they stimulate, the worse the problem gets because that's what they're stimulating. They're not stimulating real economic growth, stimulating the problem. They're stoking the fire.
What about the economy, Peter? Because we have cash for clunkers and stimulus, which in the government's mind is designed to help the economy. But Austrian economists have problems with this type of intervention. So what is the reality of the economy?
Well, cash for clunkers is an example of the worst possible thing the government can do. Think about what cash for clunkers is. The U.S. government goes deeper into debt, right? We're already in a lot of debt. The government borrows more money from Japan and from China and gives it to American citizens to encourage them to destroy the cars that they already own, the cars that they've already paid for. They don't have any more car loans against these cars. They're fully paid for cars. They work. They're able to drive them. And this money says, here, we'll give you this money on the condition that you destroy the car that you own and take out a car loan, go into debt, commit to a car payment that right now you don't have. And so what we're doing is we're destroying working assets and going deeper into debt. Why would we want to do that when we're suffering from too much debt? We're in a recession. The economy is weak. Why should we be destroying our clunkers? We should be driving these clunkers until the engines fall out. We don't have the money for new cars. We just shouldn't be buying. When you're broke, right, if you lose your job, you don't decide to put in a swimming pool in your house. You've got to save your money. You've got to be frugal. We need to be frugal with our resources. We can't squander them buying ourselves brand new cars. And a lot of these brand new cars, where are we getting them? They're from Japan. We're running up the trade deficit. I mean, it's crazy.
With regards to Warren Buffett's recent comments, because you've been critical of some of his ideas with regards to short-term inflation, would you mind elaborating on that, on some of your criticisms of what Buffett's had to say recently?
Well, Buffett basically is speaking out of two sides of his mouth because on the one hand, he's saying we have to be worried about inflation and a weak dollar. And on the other hand, he's applauding Congress and the president for the actions they've taken that are the reason that we have to worry about inflation and the weak dollar. So he can't have it both ways. If he's worried about inflation and the weak dollar, he's got to oppose the stimulus. He's got to be against President Obama. He's got to be against Congress. He can't keep telling the government, do whatever it takes to get us out of this mess, when everything they're doing is simply creating inflation. See, apparently Warren Buffett thinks that inflation is a problem, but he thinks it's worth it. He thinks creating inflation is going to be worth the long-term pain, that the short-term gain of the inflation is worth the long-term pain of enduring it. But that's not true. And also to think that Buffett is saying that what the government is doing is getting us out of our economic mess, that they're saving the economy. They're not saving it. They're killing it. We don't need more debt. That's not how turn around. In fact, Buffett even talked about the problems of all the debt that we have and how this is the problem. Well, if he's worried about debt, why is he applauding Congress's effort to lead us deeper into debt? We're taking on trillions of dollars of new debt that we didn't have before. And it's not necessary because it's not helping us restore a healthy economy. We're just borrowing money and spending it. We're blowing it on more consumption, and we're using it to expand government. Now, that's the worst thing we can do, because the bigger we make government, the less productive we're going to be. So if we had a problem before, we got an even bigger one now because we've got more government standing in our way.
Can you update us on your thoughts on the housing market? Because the government put out a recent report the other day saying that housing sales were up, and some of this is seasonal factors. But what is the reality of the housing situation, Peter?
Well, look, Americans overspent on housing, obviously. Home prices are still too high. They're going to keep falling in real terms. The market is not bottoming. Just because there's a slight bump up in sales from much depressed levels, it doesn't mean the situation's going to turn around. You've got a lot of stimulus money, remember, going into the housing market. You have the FHA now giving away home mortgages with 3% down. And, of course, with the first-time home buyer's tax credit, which means anyone who hasn't bought a home in the last 2 or 3 years, they can get credit. Generally, that credit now can be given up front, so it'll cover your 3% down. So you have a lot of people now who can buy low-cost housing with no down payments, and that's really what's going on. If you look at where the new sales are, it's in the low part of the market. That's where people are buying with zero down. This is how we got into this mess. So you've got the government subsidizing more home buying, so you have more people that are going to be getting in over their head in houses. When the market turns down, these are just future defaults. We're digging a hole deeper in the housing market right now. Meanwhile, because of all these subsidies, the home builders are still building houses. We want them to stop building houses, but we're adding supply to an already saturated market because the government refuses to let the market function. And if the government stayed out of it, housing prices would be falling and home builders would stop building. But they want people to they think we need to build homes because it's economic activity. But it's a waste of activity. We don't need to build homes when we have a record supply of vacant homes.
You were asked on Fox News about how the brakes would be applied when the time came, and you stated, quote, well, unfortunately, they really can't be put on at this point. We're just going to go over the edge of a cliff. The time to put on the brakes is long past. We're going to have to deal with the damage, end quote. Can you elaborate on that, Peter?
Yeah, well, they're talking about Alan Greenspan as Ben Bernanke stepping on the brakes before the inflation becomes a problem. Well, my point is that the lines have been cut. There are no brakes anymore. My thing is now we just have to brace for the impact. But if we don't brace for the impact, we're just going to all die in the crash. And, so we have to understand that we've already made all the mistakes. Yes, we do have to step on the brake in that we have to raise interest rates and we have to get a handle on this. But we're already going to suffer from the fact that we've left them too low for too long. And the inflation has already been created. The genie is out of the bottle. You can't just snap your fingers and the genie's back in the bottle and hasn't done any damage.
I'm kind of backtracking here just a bit, Peter, but you have senior citizens, as you know, on fixed incomes, and you're talking about running for Congress, so I'm just going to come at you with this. But I'm trying to ask you again, basically, how unethical is it that we're creating this tremendous inflation when there's this harm that you're doing to senior citizens and the elderly, many of whom don't have savings, and they just live, Social Security check to Social Security check, and it's hard enough for these people, Peter, and now they're going to be, starving from some of this? I mean, this is the problem.
Well, the government doesn't have the money to make the Social Security payments. I mean, that's part of the problem. Social Security is one of the reasons that the country is in such a hole because we've been borrowing money to finance this Ponzi scheme for so many years. The money that the people who are collecting Social Security from now, that money was embezzled years ago by the government and spent. There's no money there. The trust funds have nothing. So the government has to go into debt to make these payments. And so Social Security payments aren't going to be made. My solution would be to try to find a way, not even privatize it, just try to reform the program so that the people who really, really need it right now, who are completely dependent on it, continue to get it, but that everybody else kind of gets phased out. Because otherwise, no one's going to get anything. If we don't get a handle on this program and understand that, it was a fraud from the beginning, that Bernie Madoff is in jail for a reason, and that reason is that Ponzi schemes don't work. And they don't work when done by Bernie Madoff, and they don't work when done by Social Security. You can't run an investment program on a Ponzi dynamic. And, and we have to change that, or no one's going to get anything, and we're going to destroy the currency trying to maintain the pyramid.
Peter, what are your thoughts on the monetary system worldwide? Are most all global paper currencies in trouble to some degree?
Well, of course, the world monetary system would be on much sounder footing if we actually had some money behind it. But unfortunately, all the currencies are fiat. They're not backed by anything. And that's the way politicians like it, because it lets them play Santa Claus. It lets them promise voters something for nothing. And that's unfortunate. But of all the paper currencies of the major economies, the U.S. is in the most danger because we've had the reserve currency for so long. And so we have a more imbalanced economy than anybody else. We've been living off our ability to print money. And the reason that all the inflation hasn't destroyed our economy already is because we've exported it. We've convinced the world. We've convinced the Chinese and the Japanese and the Saudis to hoard our dollars and send us all their stuff. But when they wake up to the reality that they've been duped and they no longer want our paper anymore, they'd rather have their stuff, then the whole thing collapsed. And that's where we are. We're on the verge of that right now.
In a recent interview with Congressman Grayson, I talked to him about the fact, and I know you've been a big Ron Paul supporter, Peter, but we talked about the fact that because he's been pushing this bill on the other side of the aisle to audit the Fed. And of course, the Fed came out and responded that if that happened, that interest rates would spike, the dollar would drop, and this would be very harmful for Americans. Did that strike you as a strange response to an audit?
Yeah, I mean, what is they're basically threatening us. It's like, they're like little kids. It's like, well, if you spank me, then I'm going to set fire to the drapery. Why would auditing the Fed cause all this to happen? Now, maybe what they're saying is, well, if the world knew what we were doing, then the dollar would collapse, which means, well, then why are you doing these things? Why are you doing things that are so bad that if anybody knew about it, the whole dollar would collapse? I mean, doesn't that show you that there's a problem here? And they're trying to say, well, it's going to compromise our independence. Maybe they're saying that. Well, what independence? There's nothing left to compromise. If they actually were independent, they might, have a point. But the fact that they simply do the Treasury's bidding right now, it's a pretense. They're acting as an arm of the federal government. They're trying to reelect politicians. They're trying to artificially stimulate the economy. There's no independence left. So we might as well at least know what they're doing.
Is Ron Paul correct then, or I can use somebody like Jim Rogers who says the Fed is immoral and should be abolished? Should it be abolished, Peter?
Well, it's tough to abolish it because the question is what's going to replace it? There's that old saying, the devil you know. So I wouldn't abolish it unless I knew what it was going to be replaced with in advance. Probably a more realistic approach, and maybe an approach that I would try to pursue if I was to be elected to the Senate, would be to try to restore the Fed's mission to more in line with the reason it was originally created and give it more independence, but take away these mandates it has for economic growth or employment. And I would like to make it illegal for the Federal Reserve to buy any U.S. government debt. I don't want it to be an engine of inflation. If it wants to create money, let it back it by something tangible, or but not have it buy treasuries. In fact, when the Fed was first created, it was not allowed to buy Treasury securities. They had to amend the Federal Reserve Act later on to allow the federal government to buy Treasury securities, but initially they weren't able to. So I would prefer to get the Fed back to that role and get it away from the role of financing deficit spending in perpetuity. I want Congress, if they want to spend money on something, to go out and appropriate it. And if they want to borrow the money, find a private buyer. Don't rely on the Fed to buy it. Find somebody in the private sector that will lend you their money willingly.
When I interviewed Congressman Stearns recently, he talked about the White House beginning to want to give the Fed more power. It sounds obviously like you're concerned of that. He was as well. I think Congressman Grayson, I don't want to speak for him, but I think he would have concerns with that also. So it sounds like you're saying if you were in Congress, you would definitely want to halt any type of action to give the Fed more power and restrict it more.
Oh, yeah, look, we need to take power away from the Fed. The Fed created these problems. The Fed is the principal architect of this disaster. To reward them with even more power is not only is it ridiculous, but the more power we give them, the more damage they're going to do, as if they hadn't done enough damage with the powers they had. Imagine how much worse they're going to make it now that we're giving them more power.
In closing here, Peter, if people would like to support your campaign, either financially or want to volunteer, if you get to that stage where you actually announce you're going to run, because I know you've raised close to $1 million already, you're on the cusp of that. This has happened very quickly for you. How do they do that? How do they get involved in your campaign?
Yeah, people can donate right now. I mean, I have an exploratory committee. I'm accepting donations. We've raised over $900,000. I've already announced that if I don't run for whatever reason, I'm returning the contributions. So there's no reason to hold off and wait till I announce. If you want to support my candidacy, you can do it right now. And if I do announce, and probably will, I'd like to have over $1 million raised by the time I do it. That would be a pretty good message to send, and I think the reporters would take that seriously. And so right now you can go to my website, which is shiftforsenate.com. Just my last name, shiftforsenate.com. And you can donate right online, or, you can mail a check to the address on the site.
I don't want to steal your thunder here, but you're so close to $1 million. You're on the cusp. If you punch up over $1 million very quickly here, will you announce you're going to run? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, it's not a question of if I hit $1 million, I'm going to announce. I would like to have over $1 million when I do announce, because I think that's also significant. So it's not like, I hit $1 million and all of a sudden I'm in. The more money I can raise, I think the more likely I am to run and the more likely I am to win. And the more seriously the media is going to take me. Because I'm going to have to raise a lot more than $1 million. I might have to raise $1 million 20 times.
Right, Peter, but these things, they tend to snowball. You get your first $1 million, people begin to go, wait, this is a real candidate, this is a viable candidate, then all the backers start to come in. So these things, in reality, they snowball very quickly.
And look, hopefully I can win. Look, you mentioned Alan Grayson. He's been a client of mine for 10 years. I contributed $2,400 to his campaign when he called me up and told me he was running. And, he'd never been in politics, and he got elected. I mean, I'm trying to get elected to a bigger seat, the U.S. Senate, but you can do it. A first-time guy can come in and win. I mean, I think we really need somebody in the Senate who's similar to Ron Paul in that respect, but in the U.S. Senate. And if I can get there, and maybe Ron Paul's son, Rand, can get there, we can make a difference. We can convince other senators. It's just the beginning. We can try to build a critical mass by convincing one senator after another to change, that they're going in the wrong direction, that the advice that they've been following, the advice of the Bernanke's, the advice of the Geithners, this is wrong. These guys don't know what they're talking about. We're just making the same mistakes over and over again, thinking that if we just stimulate enough, if we just blow enough air, we can reflate the bubble. Well, A, we can't do it, and B, why would we want to? If we know it's a bubble, why would we want to blow it back up? It's only going to burst again, only with a bigger pop.
Peter, and then I'll let you go. I was interviewing Gerald Celente recently, and he talked about 2012 being the year that it would really become the progressive libertarian movement. And I know some of your views fall in line with that philosophy. Isn't it the reality that that is going to be probably most likely the case? And you're sort of right in the center at this as you begin to run for Congress a little bit ahead of the curve?
Well, sure. Well, that's what I'm thinking. I'm looking at the 2012 elections and thinking, what can I do now to help influence the way those elections pan out? If I can win a Senate race now, if I can win a Senate seat in Connecticut, which is a Democratic state, if I can win it and put an R on that seat, but do it from a real conservative, libertarian type stance, really shrink government, anti-big government, sound money, running against the Bush wing of the party, kind of like the Goldwater running against the Rockefeller wing, trying to move the Republican Party, switch the Republican Party dramatically towards that wing, that maybe we can lay the foundation for more candidates come in, and government is the problem, the free market is the solution, somebody running to shrink government, to cut programs, to cut departments, and have a Congress that's committed to follow through with that.
Peter, I would keep telling you I'm going to let you go, and I promise this is the last question, but Charlie Munger talked recently, and I know you know this, but he talked about the need to pull these banking interests out of the government, but that these elite banking interests, you almost have to perform surgery, but that these interests did not want surgery, but that it would be better for the wider civilization to have this surgery performed, basically to remove these people. Isn't this movement what you're involved in and what Ron Paul is involved in, and everything you're talking about really ultimately not just to create a smaller government, but to remove these elite banking interests from the government?
Well, I think right now the bankers are controlling government. I mean, look at everybody who's making policy. They're all coming from Wall Street, from the banking center, and they're all serving their own interests. And they're serving to try to maintain this financial bubble economy. And as long as they're doing that, they're preventing a more viable economy from rising to take its place. So we need to let this happen. We need to have real interest rates. We need much higher interest rates, and of course, that's going to end the party for all these banks and investment banks, and a lot of them are going to fail, and we have to let them fail. And we can't let the politicians tell us that if we don't prop up these banks and preserve their big salaries and their big bonuses, that somehow the whole country is going to collapse. It's not going to collapse. We don't need these major banks. They're doing much more harm than good. Let them fail. Let these people find real jobs.
Thank you so much for joining us, Peter.
Thanks for having me on. Again, it's SchiffForSenate.com if you want to support my efforts to get into the U.S. Senate and retake America.
Thank you for joining us at KingWorldNews.com. Remember to tune in next week for another great show where we will have Rob Arnott, who manages $30 billion over at Research Affiliates. Also, remember to go to our Gold Plus page for exclusive weekly interviews with Ted Butler and Gatta, and the business page for Barry Ritholtz, author of Bailout Nation.